Today is Sunday, September 10th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. One thing that I've noticed since becoming a Catholic, and I have to admit, I didn't notice this when I was a Protestant, but I've noticed it since becoming a Catholic, is that there are many Catholic men who have an idea about fatherhood which argues that fathers need to spend lots and lots of time with their children, especially young children, infants, toddlers, elementary age children, and so on. I never knew this as a kid growing up. When I was growing up, my father went to work. My uncles worked. The men were working. The kids were usually in the house or playing, and they were being taken care of by the women. There was always a separation of men and women and children. When I became a Christian as a teenager, that same division seemed true in Christian society. Women were friends together and did things together and helped one another with pregnancy and infant care and education and things like that. And the men worked, provided for their families, and had fellowship among their fellow men. They had Bible studies and men's group activities and things like that outside of work hours. But it was clear that the women understood themselves to be responsible for the children, and the men understood that their primary responsibility was providing for their families. And that really meant being away from their children, working with other men, developing their expertise in their different fields, and seeking to provide generously for their family through honest, skillful work. And that's the culture that I was always used to. Men are working with men, and women were normally the ones, and I'm talking about married men and women. Married men were working with other men, professionally away from home, and women, married women, were at home caring for the children. Many of the children went to school. Some of the families homeschooled, but the children were with the women. And the men were working with men. Again, that was the culture that I was used to, both as an unbeliever and as a Protestant Christian. When I converted to Catholicism, however, I learned that there was a different view of fatherhood among some Catholics. And this was primarily true of Catholic homeschool families, where men have the idea that it's of the highest importance that fathers spend lots of time with their young children, even with infants and toddlers. You'll see these men at church, for example, carrying infants around, walking around carrying a diaper bag. There's this idea that the father is somehow responsible for the care of infants and toddlers and young children. You'll hear that the fathers want to be intimately involved in the daily homeschool activities of kids who are 5 years old. I've experienced this as a teacher, being contacted by fathers who are all wrapped up in even preschool studies of their children. I once had a father, and I've probably shared this story before. I once had a father make a big stink about preschool lessons in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy because he felt that they were philosophically unsound. Of course, a few years later, that amazing man ended up divorced. But there's this wacky idea that married men with children should be hovering around the house, intimately involved in the everyday life, I mean hour by hour life of young children. I even saw it recently in one of my students' responses to one of Aesop's fables. The student objected to one of Aesop's fables because the fable taught the importance of work, the importance of looking ahead to future needs and working responsibly in the present, because there will be times in the future when we're not able to work, and therefore we need to work diligently today. It's the parable or the fable of the ant and the fly, an ancient moral fable from Aesop, where the fly is buzzing around, doing nothing and boasting to the ant who's constantly working, boasting to the ant about how boring the ant's life is, how the ant constantly troubles himself with work and the fly has so much fun. The fly boasts of how he gets to do all these things, go to all these different places, see all these things, and the ant just works and works. And the moral of the fable is that winter comes and the fly dies. And the ant, who worked all through the year to prepare for the winter, lives securely through the winter. And so the moral of the fable is the same as that which is taught in sacred scripture in the Proverbs. It's go and study the ant and learn how to work responsibly. And yet we find a Christian child objecting to the fable of the ant and the fly because it's clear that her father has taught her that men need to spend time at home and they can't allow themselves to work too much. The kids have been taught this message about how working for money, it's always made to appear that money is a bad thing, that there's some kind of magic number that's a good amount of money and more money than that is bad. But the kids are being taught that men shouldn't work too much because they need to be home. They need to be with their young children. They need to be criticizing, for example, one of Aesop's fables on the importance of men working to provide for future needs. And I've seen since becoming a Catholic, particularly among homeschooling people, I've seen this culture of men opposed to work because they believe that being away from your family, being engaged in secular activities for the sake of business, is somehow ungodly and worldly. And if work is pursued to provide for more than the basic necessities, it's some kind of covetousness that should be avoided. And men should work just for enough money to cover the costs of living, and then spend as much time as possible with their children. This is the lifestyle among these men. Now, this is a lifestyle that my wife and I, who have 10 children and homeschool, my wife and I have never considered such a lifestyle. And I'm thankful that we didn't. The first reason we never considered it was because there were never any examples in my life, in my knowledge of history, in my knowledge of the lives of any wise or famous men of the past, where this lifestyle was lived or even suggested. In fact, if we go back to the virtuous pagans before the Christian era, we find Xenophon explaining how man is equipped for work outside the home and how the woman is equipped by nature for work within the home with the children. It was always clear, even before Christian religion was established, that men should work. It was obviously clear that men should be away from home when we consider men's military duties. When men worked as farmers, it was obvious that they didn't spend time around their wives and children all day long, but they were in the fields with other men working. There's never any record in history or scripture, really anywhere among virtuous men, that shows men changing diapers, feeding babies, babysitting toddlers, and so on. That's the work of women. Women are equipped for it by nature. Women are better at it. The disposition of women is designed for the care of children. And the ideal arrangement of the family consists of a man who St. Paul refers to as the stronger vessel, who's wired for more rigorous, stressful activity, to be the one who leaves home, goes into the world, conducts business, and provides a safe and well-supplied place for his wife and children. And when a man does this, a wife can handle that work by herself, especially in a modern age where there are so many conveniences. a woman really doesn't need assistance in caring for the home or for the children. And it should be assumed, that this woman is a member of the Christian community, has friends among other women, relatives among other women, and these women collaborate. They collaborate in and through one another's homes to help one another with this work of caring for the homes and providing for the children. We see an example of this in the life of the Virgin Mary, where we see her relationship with her cousin, Saint Elizabeth. Mary learns that Elizabeth is pregnant, and she makes a trip to go visit and assist her cousin. And we find Mary receiving the same kind of assistance from other women. We could say that, well, Joseph was with Mary, because of an extraordinary circumstance where he was forced to travel far from their home because there was a census to be taken, and he needed to leave Nazareth and travel to Bethlehem for the sake of the census, which is why Jesus was born in a manger and why Joseph was present with Mary. But even there, tradition tells us that Mary was assisted by at least one other woman. And it wasn't normal for men to be present with their wives, either at a childbirth or during the infant's lives, when the infant really needed the care of its mother. The men were working. Now, one of the reasons why it was important for men to work is because these simple little babies, who really need nothing other than a mother when they're born or throughout pregnancy, these simple little babies are going to grow up. They're going to spend, in our generation, more than in the past. They're going to spend, let's say, 17 or 18 years at home as legal minors dependent on their parents, and then the time is going to come for them to establish their own independent adult lives, to move into the world and find a way to obtain honest, we could say, employment, with the understanding that one can also be self-employed. But we understand that by age 18, it's expected for children to begin moving into the world and establish themselves independently. Their education is to be preparing them for this adult independence, and the transition between childhood and adulthood is a very challenging one. And the child transitioning from childhood to adulthood needs a great deal of help. And at this point in his life, the mother is not the natural source of that help, but the father. The child entering into adulthood needs to be prepared to find a place in professional society, in the market, where he can earn a living. He needs help making connections in that professional society. He needs help finding a place with skill that is capable of generating a living. Not a few dollars, not an allowance, but a real living. And we get into numbers of thousands of dollars per month. And this is not easy. But that child entering into adulthood should have some assistance because his father has been engaged in that community for the past 20 or more years. His father should have connections. His father should have colleagues and friends, business partners, references, men who possess all different kinds of skills, men who practice different trades and professions. The child's father should have relations with these people. The father should be able to prepare his son to enter into the community where the father himself has been engaged for 20 plus years, and should be able to help his son transition successfully and securely into that adult professional society. Now, the experiences of that child during his infancy are forgotten at this time. The experiences of that child as a toddler, we can put some kind of emotional spin on them, but they're relatively insignificant because the burdens and the challenges of this transition into adulthood are so great that if the child doesn't succeed in making this transition successfully, he's likely to suffer for the rest of his life. Because while his natural window of opportunity to make this transition opens and closes, another wave of younger people are coming up behind him. The window is not going to stay open for him forever. There's going to be a constant supply of new men coming into working age. And that natural window of opportunity is going to shrink, if not close entirely. And therefore there's a natural time, there's a natural way for a young man to enter into adult society, and to do so as one who can earn a living. And preparation for this time, the preparation for this time is the principal work of a father while that child is growing up through his childhood. The father is not just thinking about his own monthly expenses selfishly, but he's thinking about the needs of his children whom he has produced, whom he has brought into the world. He's thinking about his children and the challenges they're going to face when they reach young adulthood, and rather than working to pay his rent or cover the costs of his own electricity or grocery bill, he's also supposed to be working like the ant, thinking about the future needs, not only of himself, but also of his children, and working to prepare to help them as they make their transition into adulthood. Now, the culture that I spoke of being familiar with when I was younger and when I was a Protestant always made this a priority. When I was growing up, my father had connections everywhere because of his business and social relationships. When I came up into my teenage years, I began to be introduced to these connections. They were mechanics, they were craftsmen, police officers, on and on, all of these different men whom through the years my father worked with, developed relationships with, did business with, helped, did favors for, and so on. And when I showed up on the scene, let's say when I went to work with my father as a teenager, these other men were eager to meet me and welcome me into the fellowship, as it were. They were excited to see me working with Dad. They were excited to help me. And they looked at me as a new member of their club whom they were eager to help out. And all the benefits of that adult working community became available to me, like a fraternity. Oh, you're having trouble with your Jeep? You need a new exhaust for your Jeep? Oh, that's no problem. Go down Route 18 and talk to Jess. He'll help you out because I just helped him out with some work that he needed done in his shop. I'll give him a call, tell him you need some help with your Jeep. And there I go, pull into the mechanic shop to be greeted by the owner who tells me he'll take care of it no cost. My father did that. My father provided that connection. I'm a college student, have no money, need a car. It's no problem. A few phone calls, we can find a car. No problem. Because my father's connections and friends worked in every different area. And so when I went into young adulthood, I had connections and help everywhere. I could find a job. If I needed some money, I could find the job by some men or an uncle making a phone call. I was helped into adult life because the men in my life were working all through my childhood. Working, helping one another, building these professional resources and businesses and connections. And I was able to walk into those benefits. Now for me it was a little different because I had intellectual gifts and wanted to go to college. And so when I went to college, I found myself received by another group of men, namely my professors, who were eager to do the same for me. They were eager to introduce me to their friends, to connect me with their resources, to invite me to conferences with them, even to visit their homes, because they were men who took their profession seriously. And one of their favorite things to do was to help young men transition successfully into adult life. So whether I needed a new exhaust system for my Jeep or help getting into graduate school, there were networks of professional men that helped me transition into adult life. And that network of men and that networking continues in my life to this day. But I understood when I began to have my own children, I understood that I had to do for them the same thing that the men in my life did for me. I had to make those relations. I had to make those connections. I had to prepare those resources, and so on. because that transition from childhood to adulthood would be the most important period of time in my children's life. And I wanted to make it as successful and stress-free as I possibly could. It's just the golden rule. I wanted to do for my children what the men in my life did for me when I was a child. And that's what I did. I didn't spend time with my infant children. I didn't change diapers. I didn't carry babies. I didn't feed babies. While my wife did those things, I was working. I was working around the clock. And I'll confess that there were many times where it probably would have been better for me at various moments in my children's lives if I was involved more. However, the benefits that I had prepared for my children for the time when they would need to transition into adult life so far outweighed any of those benefits, which were quickly moved on from as the kids grew up. Yeah, sure, there were some difficult times the kids had to go through at various points in their younger years, but those problems that were faced in those younger years were nothing compared to the problems that were waiting for them when it was time to transition into adult life. And I focused all my attention on preparing to help them when they would transition into adult life. I did things specifically thinking of how I could help my adult children. And so I worked while they grew up. My wife took care of the children. My wife kept the house. And I worked, and I worked, and I worked. I worked to become self-employed so that I could hire my own children. So that when my children are college students, they don't need to find all kinds of trashy, distracting part-time jobs, but they can stay focused on their studies, focused on their own career path, and I can help them financially in exchange for some work. I made sure that we were in a position financially where we could support them and help them during their college years so they could live on campus and just focus on schoolwork. They chose to enter into the military, which added a great deal of resources. But even their transition into military life was assisted by the friendship that was established between the military recruiters and my wife and I, as our kids went through that discernment process. We befriended the recruiters, turned the recruiting process into a friendship, and my kids benefited incredibly by having recruiters that truly looked out for them and gave them good advice and helped them at various points to get exactly to the place they wanted to be in their military careers. When it was time for college, because we chose to take responsibility for the kids' education, I was able to prepare their transcripts and help them gain admission to the colleges that they wanted to go to. There was no stress, there was no confusion. Everything was very simple because I was working on preparing their education, not as toddlers, not fussing about preschool lessons, not reading them storybooks, but preparing for standardized testing, college admission, high school transcript completion, preparation for college studies, and so on. And they've been able to not only go on to college, but be Dean's List students in college, not only to get into college, but to succeed in college, to be prepared intellectually for college studies. That's what I was working on when they were being cared for by my wife. And so though we have 10 children, we've currently got our oldest 4 in college, happy and well provided for as they transition into their own unique adult occupations. And the younger children coming up, again, whom I spend very little time with, are excited and optimistic seeing the success enjoyed by their older siblings. And I can testify that though I've spent very little time with them as young children, they love and respect me because now they see what I was doing all along. Now they understand why Dad's always working, why Dad doesn't play with us, why Dad doesn't read a book to us. They might not have understood that when they were 7, but I wasn't concerned with raising happy 7-year-olds. I was concerned with raising happy adults, because they're going to spend the next 40 to 50, even 60 years as adults. And that's what I invested my time and energy in. We hear people in the church complaining about how all of the kids are falling away from the faith when they reach young adulthood. And everyone points at the clergy and says, you know, you're not reaching our children. They get to be 16, 17, 18, and they lose all interest in religion. And I shake my head at that and say, no, that's not what's happening. That's not what's happening. The clergy are doing exactly what the clergy is supposed to do. The problem that's happening in the lives of these Catholic kids is they're being raised in a dishonest bubble of childhood where the coming winter is ignored in their lives, where the challenges that await them are being neglected as if they don't exist. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these kids find themselves pushed out of the nest into a world that they were never told about, never prepared for, in which they have no connections, no resources, no help, and they go into young adult life in a state of desperation, and they have to live in what I call survival mode. They're attacked with confusion, uncertainty, stress, loneliness, and so on. And then we have to hear everybody complaining about how all these young adults are depressed. The problem is not the Catholic Church. The problem is not the Catholic faith. The problem is this irresponsible idea of male parenting. Because these kids have this event on the horizon in their life, and their fathers ignore it. And yes, we can all dress up and play Catholic. We can play church. And we can take pictures of our kids all dressed up when they're 9 years old and 10 years old and 12 years old Everybody's smiling. Look at it. Isn't this life so much fun? Isn't this life so easy? All we do is go to Mass and say our prayers and talk about saints and play with Daddy. Everything's so fun. And then all of a sudden, the kids in these Catholic homes experience exactly what the kids in the public schools experience. When this fantasy world that they've been raised in ends, and their lovey, cuddly, playtime daddy suddenly switches characters and says, "You need to learn to provide for yourself now. You need to find a way to make a living. You need to choose a career. You need to do this and this and this." Just like the public school goes from giving the kids lunch, hosting their playtimes, providing the playgrounds for them, the gymnasiums, the sports activities, clubs, and all kinds of services for them to enjoy, pampering them through their school years, and then all of a sudden they're handed a diploma and said, "See ya." And this whole fantasy world locks the door on these kids. And they find themselves walking around with a high school diploma, completely unwarned of and unprepared for the reality that was always outside the doors. You can't play Catholic anymore. You can't just take days to putz around the house and talk about the lives of the saints, sit around and watch saint movies. Suddenly you can't go to daily Mass anymore because you can't even find transportation. You have no income. You have no place to live. You have no money for groceries. And you're pushed into this survival mode of life. And that's what happens to these young kids. It's what happens to school kids in K-12 schools. It's what happens to homeschool kids, whose parents pretend that isolation is real virtue. And that it would be true if isolation was for the sake of preparation. The argument for isolation could be made. But if isolation is for the neglect of preparation, living a life of denial, simply refusing to acknowledge the responsibilities that lie ahead and the challenges that lie ahead, pretending that one can live and simply not go through them. That's, to some degree, a kind of abuse of parenting. And this is what commonly happens. And this is why we have this crisis, not just of young adults leaving the faith, but having no interest in religious life, because they say, well, I want to go to college. They have no money prepared for college. They've got no clue how to get through college. They start signing up for student loans in desperation, and the next thing they know, vocational talk is over. They end up studying subjects in school that they have no actual clue about, no connections in the fields, no realistic prospects for success in any of those fields. And they just try to keep the fantasy world going. Maybe if I just keep going to school, I can push off this day when I become accountable to the world. I can just keep pushing it back and keep pushing it back and keep pushing it back as my student loans grow and grow and grow. Then we've got the crazies who think, well, you know what I'd like to do? I don't have any answers for my adult life, but I'd like to get married and have kids because I'm pro-life. And I can just be a dad, and my wife can just be a mom, like my mom and dad. And you see how this craziness is then perpetuated. And people begin to think that reproducing is some kind of occupation, some responsible vocation, just reproducing. No provision for the education of those children that will come, no provision for the needs of that family. Oh, there's social services available. We'll just hop on to WIC, we'll use some state healthcare program, we'll string together social services. Oh, we're conservatives, by the way. And you just see this mess of culture that develops, this moral crisis that develops, where there's a disconnect between everything that's spoken and everything that's actually done. And while we look out into secular society and we find this abortion culture where fathers are content to make babies, but they want no responsibility to provide for them, and the women are left with the choice to either live as quote-unquote single moms or to abort them. For all the talk, when we turn the camera over to focus on the Christian, or I should say Catholic, because like I said, I didn't see this when I was a Protestant, we find really something of the same culture among Catholic men. They love this idea of making babies, and they're better than the abortion daddies, but not very much. They're willing to play with some children, but they don't seem to understand or have any interest in the need to work for those children, because those children are only children for a few years, and the real burden of their life comes to them when they transition into adulthood. And this is the phase of life that's become miserable for modern teenagers, because it's just completely unprovided for. It's completely unprovided for. They're sent out of the house like kids given driver's license with no driver lessons, with no student driving experience. They're just given a license and sent away to figure out how to drive by driving. And you can think that that's cute. Some people will brag and say, yeah, well, that's what I had to do. Did you like that? Was that good for you? If it wasn't good for you, then you're not practicing the golden rule. Yeah, there are aspects of my life, especially with respect to going to college and establishing my career, starting a business, and so on. There are many, many things that I had to figure out on my own, and learning by experience is very, very expensive and painful. I would never wish that on anyone. In fact, we're not supposed to need to do that. We're supposed to have experienced men in our lives to give us counsel and direction, to not have to do that. And most of us don't have men like that because the men are playing with toddlers. And this is a problem that I see increasing because it's sort of wrapped up in this traditional Catholic culture where there's no Catholic lay culture anymore. The way that you show yourself to be faithful is by hanging out in the sanctuary. It's becoming Protestantism. In Protestantism, what often happens among lazy men is that they're averse to the duty of the laity to actually go into the secular world and influence temporal affairs according to God's will. They really don't want to do that. They also don't really want to be religious. They just want to play with religion and use religion as an excuse to not take up the work of the laity. Like a soldier who wants to join the army so that he can wear a uniform and walk around town with army shirts on, but then not actually go to PT, not actually go to drill, not actually go to war. He just wants to get his military discount at Subway. Modern fatherhood has become like that in many places. Men want the benefits of marriage and fatherhood, but they don't want the responsibilities. And so their kids are just left to go into the world. And if you look at the condition of the life of these young men, if you look at the condition of the life of these teenagers trying to transition into adulthood, what you see is that the condition of their life is almost exactly the same as the condition of orphans and of the children of single moms. They're left in almost the same condition because effectively, actually, they don't enjoy the benefits that they should have as children with fathers who have been working as men to provide for them in the present, for sure, but also to prepare provision for them to transition into independent adult life of their own. They enter young adulthood like orphans, like the children who are abandoned by their fathers. And so the effects that can be seen point to the cause. And so for all the talk, for all of the hype, for all of the, oh, you're such a good father, you know, I see you always playing with your kids, you're always at the park, always at baseball games. That's play. That's not the work of fathers. The question that men have to answer is, how are you working to prepare to assist your children to transition successfully into adult life? When that time, when that window opens for them to make that transition. When we see kids thriving during their college years, when we see young adults thriving, we see the signs of kids for whom parents, particularly fathers, have made provision for their adult life. Normally, these men are bad-mouthed. These men are bad-mouthed through the years when their kids are growing up. They're called workaholics. They're complained about that all they worry about is money. They're worldly. They don't sit home and read books to their kids. They don't play on the floor with their kids. They don't coach their kids' birthday baseball team. They don't volunteer for their kids' Boy Scout activities. They're criticized all through their children's younger years. But then all of a sudden, when these kids hit that transitional phase, these men have adult lives prepared for their children. They help them not to enjoy the best Barney birthday party in the world, but to enjoy life at a great college, successful transition and preparation into a desirable career, free them from anxiety and stress that leads to all kinds of bad habits and vices. They make that way of transition smooth. And we see these kids, we see them at church, we see them in the community, we see them entering into adulthood, and it looks like adulthood is easy for them. Because it is. Because their fathers have prepared for these days for them and helped them to make that transition so they don't have to go through this miserable, gloomy, stressful, debt-ridden, half-dressed young adulthood. They don't have to do that. If their kids need some money, the fathers say, look, it's much easier for me to make money than you. Why don't you stay focused on your own career preparation? Because it's not time for you to make money yet. Just tell me what you need. I can help you. That's what makes the difference for young adults. A young adult who needs to borrow some money has a very different prospect when he can borrow from his father with no interest, the way money is supposed to be lent, rather than be sent to a credit card company or to a bank to take out a high interest loan because the kid's got no credit. How is that an advantage? That's not a plan. That's a last resort for a kid who has no other options. It's just not responsible. So all these years as this kid has grown up, he was born, let's say, when his father was 25 years old. So from age 25 until the kid was 18, where the father would be 43 years old, that father could have been working to prepare for the day when his son was 18 years old, and he was 18 years into his career, in his early 40s, stable, still young enough to work and generate honest income. But this man also likely had other children. So he had another child, let's say, when he was 27, another when he was 30, another when he was 32. And as each child came, he chose to be the daddy who plays in the nursery. And so while his oldest son was growing, he was looking to the toddlers and playing. And that oldest son reaches 18 years of age, and he's got a 43-year-old father who's become an expert in building Lego towers and reading Dr. Seuss books, even playing video games. I see it all the time. And he's got a kid who's now 18 years old who doesn't have a 43-year-old father. He's got a father who is basically still 25 years old, if that. And there's no provision for this 18-year-old young man. And so he's forced to go find his own way. And we see these kids in these families, and they're miserable. And where's Dad? Dad's playing with the 6-year-old, while the 18-year-old faces the most important decisions of his life, with no wisdom, no counsel, no provision, no help, no resources, no connections. That's the reality of this philosophy of fatherhood. And what's deceiving is that these men are often praised as being great fathers. Oh, he's a great father, always with the kids, always around with his wife, always doing all these good things for his kids. Yeah, for his 6-year-old kids. He does good things for some of his kids during a portion of their life. But it's an awfully imperfect philosophy of fatherhood. And as I said, I feel like this is becoming more and more common. So what happens in these families? Well, what happens is these men, they don't study, they don't mature as they should, they don't study and grow intellectually as they should, they don't gain experience and grow professionally as they should, they don't work their way up through promotions as they should and gain experience at higher levels in their fields. They remain entry-level workers. And they say, well, that's good enough because it provides for what you need in a very narrow-minded sense. Very imperfect sense. And so they actually are not in a position at age 40 to go back into the workplace if financial needs arise. So what happens? The only work opportunity that's available is some entry-level work. Entry-level work. The father ends up being too prideful to go and take a job through some entry-level position because he wants a job that's appropriate for a 40-year-old man, even though he's got the skills and knowledge of a 25-year-old man. He's too prideful to take the job he actually deserves and qualifies for. And so the wife goes and takes an entry-level job. And so we often find these men who are talking all this talk about being great fathers and serious about their children and their family life, sending their wives out to earn the money that the family needs. So now the duty of the wife is to bear the children, nurse the children, and provide for the children. What does that look like? That looks like the life of a single mom. That's the life of a baby mama. She lives the same quality of life as the woman who's abandoned by the man who leaves her pregnant to raise the kids for herself. This Christian woman, even though she's been married for 20 years, has the same quality of life as the so-called single mom. Her kids have the same problems in their life as the single mom. And you can just see how this warped view of family life develops. And if you look around, and if this speaks of your own situation, I'm sorry if this is painful, but it's reality. And if you look around, You'll see this more and more and more. You'll see a woman bearing 4, 5, 6 kids who, when she's 40 years old, has to go and work. And what do the mothers do? The mothers take entry-level work because they're desperate. They have no choice. And these so-called fathers playing this role of the patriarch, they're not going to take those jobs, and so they pretend that maybe it's best for mom to get a job, and it's just nuts. It's nuts. It's the whole natural order of the family turned upside down. Women go along with it for the same reason that the single moms go along with their lifestyle. Most of them wish things could be different, but they would rather just not fight about it. They'd rather just find a solution, which is respectable. And I'm not talking to the women. Many of these women do the best that they can. And the problem in this culture is not the women. The women are doing the work of the women and the men. The problem in this culture is the men. And the difference is that in one culture, in the baby mama culture, the dads just up and leave. They make it very clear that they have no interest in raising or in bearing the responsibilities of fatherhood. Whereas in these Christian circles, somehow the father chooses to stick around and pretend to be a great father, even though the same problems exist in the families. Now, you can say I'm being very harsh, but to be honest, I'm speaking out of my concern for the women and the children. I really am not concerned if this is offensive to grown men. I feel bad for the women and children, and not even so much the women, because to some degree they deserve what they have. They choose to marry these men who are fooling around like goofballs when they're 20 years old. They fall into this whole lie about dating and having fun together, and they say, oh, I have so much fun with John, I wish we could be married, and they marry a guy who does nothing but plays. So they really can't complain. So I feel bad for the women, but only to an extent. But for the kids, I really feel bad, because not only are they put in a position where they can hardly be expected to do well. The expectations are so ridiculous and hypocritical. But they're forced to bear so much stress. And then when they finally stumble, they're pointed at and accused of abandoning the faith, as if all they had to do was keep walking in the same path and they would have lived happily ever. It's just not realistic. And then, rather than taking credit or taking the blame, I should say, for the problems that the kids face, the parents just talk about it like, yeah, well, Tommy chose to not be a Catholic, so, nothing we can do to help him. And they actually pretend like the problems in Tommy's life were caused by Tommy's adult choices. I feel bad for those kids. Those kids are given no help when they need it. They're made to bear unnatural burdens. And then their fathers lie and pretend that they got what they deserve for making bad choices, as if everything had been provided for them and they simply chose to throw it all away, which is a lie. So anyway, if you're a Catholic father who is thinking about the future needs of your children and is working to prepare a successful path by which your children can transition well into adult life, don't let this culture discourage you. I've had to fight against it constantly. Don't let this fake daddy culture discourage you. Don't let anyone tell you you should be doing this, you should be spending more time at home, you should be working less, you should be spending more time with your 4-year-old, you should be this, you should be... Don't listen to that, because when that kid is 18 years old and needs thousands of dollars for help and needs to go to college, needs to know how to successfully enter into the job market or the professional world, everyone's going to look at you and say, well, did you provide for it? And you're going to look like a fool, and they're all going to mock you then, just as they mock you now. You're never going to win by giving into this stupid culture. You should do for your children what you would want your 30-year-old, 40-year-old father to do for you. Help him enter successfully into adulthood. And for men who are wrapped up in this foolish, perpetual childhood culture, where the goal of fatherhood is to raise toddlers to have the greatest possible toddler experience, as if you're Walt Disney. What I ask you is what men, what great men, what exemplary men of history can you point to say, that's who I'm imitating? I know that there are Catholic men who imagine they're imitating saints, but what I ask is, what saint specifically are you imitating? And don't say Thomas More, because if you think Thomas More, who was the Chancellor of England, was sitting around playing with his toddlers, you're just deceiving yourself. You need to go and actually read a biography of Thomas More before you go on telling yourself that you're like Thomas More. There's a reason why Thomas More's children had tutors, because their father was not home. He was a very active, professional, political man. He was not sitting in the living room reading Dr. Seuss to the kids. If you're going to talk about saints, actually read their biographies. Because I hear this appeal to saints all the time for all kinds of things, which only reveals that the biographies of the saints are not being studied. Your kids are growing up, and these years of their childhood are relatively insignificant. In fact, if they grow up physically healthy, they'll be in a position to enter well into adult life. It's very simple. Your duty as a Catholic father is to initiate your children to the sacramental life of the Church, to initiate them into the Catholic life, not to make them chasers of obscure devotions and endless religious activities at the expense of other responsibilities that belong to the life we live in the flesh as human beings. Your kids need you to help provide for their transition into adult life, which is going to be the most difficult and stressful time, the most influential time of their life. And helping them to make that transition for you as a 40 to 50-year-old man is actually very easy work if you use your 20s and 30s to work for your children. And even though they may fuss now and then that you weren't there for this, or you wouldn't play with them at this time, even though they may fuss as younger children, and I'll give you a word of advice, they're going to fuss no matter how much you do for them. Even if they may fuss when they're young children, they'll be grateful forever to learn that you've prepared for them at the most important time of their life. And any memories of a missed birthday party or not being able to play baseball, those memories will be forgotten and replaced by memories of your provision and help for them through the most challenging times of their lives, which will affect them and your grandchildren for the rest of your life. I'm not going to argue about this because I see the kind of responses that come in, and they're insane. It's craziness. I'm not going to go back and forth on this. I'm just stating this as a warning from an experienced 48-year-old man with 4 kids who have transitioned well into adult life. I've seen it all. I've seen men go that route. I've resisted that route, and I've seen what happens to their kids when they get to adulthood. I've seen my kids in their early years, and I've seen what happens to them in their adulthood, and I know that I'm right. So this is my warning. Again, not something that I'm interested in debating because the arguments are going to be absurd. It's just my warning. And I hope that young men listen to it and get it right. God bless.